This is the MAST 2024 webinar series that takes you on a scientific voyage through the depths of marine science without the need to pack a suitcase. So today's talk will introduce us to the Ocean Knowledge Action Network. Our speaker today is a seasoned conservation and environmental management professional with more than 2 decades of experience in academia, federal government, not-for-profit global conservation, and tech. They currently lead the Ocean Knowledge Action Network, which is a unique and innovative I knew that was going to catch me out. Innovative global network of networks, bringing together scientists, lawyers, policymakers, stakeholders, and funders to stimulate the collaboration and knowledge exchange that is needed to find new ways of co-creating ocean science for a sustainable future. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Linwood Pendleton.
Great. Well, it's nice to talk to everybody, and I'll keep this presentation relatively short so we can have a good discussion. I'll just mention, I see there are a couple of people from PML, and I first came to Europe and began working on a project that was joint between the UK and France. It was called Valmer, and that was one of my first real tastes at working cross-culturally, and it was something that really intrigued me, trying to figure out how do you do this? What are the small problems that can crop up from that? And those learnings and then 10 years of living here and more work globally have really helped inform what we've done in this network I'm going to describe to you today called the Ocean Knowledge Action Network. The Ocean Knowledge Action Network had its origins in the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences, and I was part of the executive planning group for that UN Decade of Ocean Science. And one of the premises behind the decade was that as good as our science was, and as hard as we had worked to make science relevant to policy, there was just something that was keeping us from doing what was needed. So we're doing good work, but it wasn't enough to prevent biodiversity loss. It wasn't enough to prevent climate change. It wasn't enough to prevent habitat loss and deoxygenation. And maybe part of the reason was that if you don't design science to be useful for decision-making, and decision-making could be a government policymaker, it could be someone who manages a marine park, could be someone at the grocery store or even a coastal homeowner. Those could all be decision makers. If it wasn't designed for their needs, it'd be hard for them to use that science. And so at the time, the thinking became more that maybe we needed to involve people in the entire process of science, from developing the scientific research question, doing the science together, and then disseminating the science together. And so that led to terms like co-design, co-production, co-delivery. It became co-creation, not just of science, but knowledge generally. And that opened up the world to different ways of creating evidence that may not have been based on scientific methods, may not have been based on testing, but could still have been evidence-based. In some places, people were calling this mission-oriented science. In the landscape of Future Earth, which I will come back to in a minute, some of the networks within Future Earth called this open science. And more recently, people have just been developing the whole concept of transdisciplinarity as their way of doing co-design. And the idea behind transdisciplinarity is that you involve decision makers, end users, regular people with scientists, natural scientists, social scientists, with law and legal experts, philosophers, psychologists, whoever you need really to try to develop information that is actionable. Now, to do this kind of transdisciplinarity or co-design or co-creation, there are two principal human challenges. So the first is, I mentioned all those different kinds of people that you have there. When you're working across sectors, across disciplines, scientists and non-scientists, there can be a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misunderstanding. People, even when they're speaking the same language, may use one word to mean different things. People have really different worldviews. How does the world work? What's important to them? So trying to find ways of bringing these very different people with different experiences together is a challenge and requires new ways of working, especially for scientists. And then the second challenge was that there wasn't a place for people to go to see what were the best practices for how you do this. And that was partly because scientists and people who participated in the co-design of science weren't publishing about the co-design process, they were publishing about the research outcomes. It was also the case that people generally don't like to publish about bad outcomes. And so much of what we need to communicate about how do you work with different kinds of people is what not to do. It's very hard to tell people exactly what they should do because it depends on the context. It depends on the culture, where you live, who you're working with. But there are certain things that you might want to avoid. And it would be good to know about that, but people weren't publishing about that. So a lot of this knowledge about how to do the co-design of science, how to do transdisciplinary science, was in people's heads. And that meant there wasn't a place that you could go and read about this. We couldn't create an online portal that had lots of documentation. We really had to figure out how can we create a way for people to find each other so they can share knowledge person to person. And that really is where the Ocean Knowledge Action Network came from. It was a group of people who were involved with the decade, working on the decade, who also were aware of Future Earth and its Knowledge Action Network series, which is a group of networks focusing on different kinds of topics. Some focus on hazards, some on health. And they wanted to propose the Knowledge Action Network that was focused on, or a Knowledge Action Network that was focused on the ocean, something that would really help scientists figure out how to work with the rest of the world on ocean issues. The network was built around a loose vision at the time that we have since refined to what you see here, but it was bringing together people who were all committed to finding ways of achieving a healthy, thriving ocean that benefits people and benefits life. But people were coming at this from really different perspectives with different approaches. And we decided early on that we wanted to focus on the people. And how do you bring these people together? And how do you bring them together when you're dealing with the fact that people often find themselves in different niches that I mentioned before, but you have people who have different knowledge about the ocean. They know about different things. They come at that knowledge from very different perspectives. They participate in different kinds of activities, could be business, could be science, could be education, for instance. And if we wanted to do this globally, when we think about the different kinds of cultures that you might deal with at sort of a Scottish level or at a UK level, now think about that across the globe. We have really different cultures, different kinds of relationships with the ocean, relationships with people, relationships with the government. So we really had to take these different cultures into account. We had to realize that our network may bring people from different cultures that traditionally didn't get along with each other. And we still want them to be able to communicate and share knowledge. We have all sorts of communities from very, very small islands to very large urban coastal areas. And of course, different disciplines. So the challenge there was, how do we begin to build a new way of working that's built on trust? And we started small, and over the first couple of years have now grown to have about 100 plus members. I think we're up to 130 or so from 30 countries, representing big partners and individual people. And increasingly, we have Indigenous scientists in our network. And I'll come back and talk about them in particular, because this is something that we're working on that I think is cutting edge, and something that Christine and I are working on. I'll talk about specifically in a bit. As many of these global organizations often do, we started off by thinking about the networks and the institutions that we could bring together. We had strong support early by a variety of networks on virtually every continent but Australia. And we tried a variety of different ways of working with these networks. But as we did this, we really came to the conclusion that the networks themselves don't talk to each other. It's the people in networks who talk to each other. So Beth Ann mentioned that we called ourselves a network of networks. But over time, we really started thinking of ourselves more as a network of networked people. And these networked people come from all over the world. Many times they're in multiple networks. Sometimes they lead networks. So, you have someone like Emma DeFew and Phil who are very active in SMMR that you guys may have attended last week. There's the Marine Social Sciences Network. They're big networks and small networks, but these individuals are the people who are communicating. And so the Ocean Knowledge Action Network really decided to focus on those individuals and creating ways for those individuals to get to know each other better, to build trust, and to find ways for them to communicate with each other individually. So one of the things that we always do when we meet is we remind people that we have this map in our network where people can go in, they say where they are from or where they're working, they put their personal information, contact information. So when a member of our community travels, say, to West Africa or to Malaysia, they can go to this map and see who else is in our network there, and they can meet up and keep the conversation going. We started off with an idea that came from, as I mentioned, this group that was highly involved in the decades. So the origins of this Ocean Knowledge Action Network were very much top-down. But it was a top-down approach designed to try to create a bottom-up community. And that meant really taking where we started and then constantly revising it so we could get more and more input from our community as that community began to sort of grow organically. We wanted it to be bottom up, so we wanted to respond to what the people in our community wanted to do. We wanted it to be self-organizing, which means we want people in the community to feel like they can take charge and propose things for the community to do. And we want them to be involved in the governance and leadership of this. We wanted to make sure that we didn't create a network where everyone had to communicate through the people running this network. And so our Ocean Knowledge Action Network was fortunate enough to get 3 years of funding initially for an international project office, which includes me and then Stella Alexandrov, who's here. We set the groundwork for this network, but we really wanted the network to be able to run itself eventually. And we've really gotten to that point, and I can talk about that a little bit. But initially, people in the network weren't ready to do that, especially because we were bringing people into the network who traditionally had not been in global leadership roles. They might have been from small island developing states, for instance, and were initially uncomfortable taking on such leadership. But over the years, now over 2.5, nearly 3 years, these members of our community have really stepped up to take charge and really lead this organization. Peer-to-peer learning is so important, as I mentioned. And we made the decision early on that we wouldn't focus on a theme or an approach or even co-design, even though that's the way we started. We would focus on the people. And then if there was a core within our community that wanted to dive deep into a theme, they could do so by creating a learning circle. So that was a network within our network where people would meet and then really get deep into a theme, sharing knowledge about a theme, working on papers and the like, and I'll come back and tell you how that's gone. To make this work, to sort of do all of those intentions that I just talked about, it meant we had to really redefine our common purpose, because the common purpose was given to us by a group of people who no longer represented the people who had become the network. So we spent well over a year really working on what was going to be our common purpose that really brought us together. We rewrote our governance entirely. Initially, our governance was very open, and we said, we're looking for members to join our steering committee to help lead this network. But we found that we had really amazing people applying for our steering committee, but they hadn't participated in the community. So they really were hamstrung a bit in terms of providing sound governance advice because they didn't know what was happening in the community. And if we were really going to be a bottom-up community, we thought it made more sense to make sure that the people who were governing our community were, in fact, the people who were most active in the community. So we completely rewrote our governance. And then we realized that if we were going to have people from such different backgrounds, and particularly people who may have worldviews or opinions that might be in direct conflict with each other, we needed to set some ground rules for the way we work together. And we call that our shared values charter. And this is a living document that the community has written that really outlines the ways that people expect each other to behave. This is something we remind people of before we meet, and we ask everybody who is on our steering committee or on our executive committee to sign our governance document, which includes these shared values and says they've committed to these shared values. As we've done this, we've grown a steering committee that is as representative as that map I showed you of some of our community members. Includes people from all over the world. We have people from Latin America recently have joined, no one yet from South America. We hope to bring that in. We're really hoping to bring more people in from North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia as well. But we're growing, and we didn't want to grow fast, and we don't want to grow in ways that are just meant to tick boxes. And so we're trying to be intentional about how we grow. But within the first 2 years, I'm really very happy with the coverage and diversity, so geographical diversity, disciplinary diversity, perspectives, and the like. We have a good balance between genders. We have non-binary people on our steering committee. We have young people and old people. It really is a tremendously varied group and very, very active. They're all very active, and they've taken on and are taking on more and more of the responsibilities of running the network that Stella and I have done over the past 3 years as part of the International Project Office. We have 4 main ways of working. So we do have these high concentrations of members of our network. We call those hubs. And these hubs meet frequently within their country or within their region. We have a hub in Taiwan that meets frequently, has in-person meetings there. We have another hub in the Western Indian Ocean. We're starting to develop a hub in Western and Central Africa because we have a critical mass of people there. And in Europe, we're trying to do the same thing. So working within these hubs gives people a lot of face time. And then those hubs, people from those hubs are active in our steering committee and in our OceanCan community. We try to meet in person. We were fortunate in our first year that Taiwan, so Future Earth Taiwan, gave us the money to bring 15 people from our community to Taipei to spend time together. When we really got started, COVID happened. And so we were completely remote for the first year and a half, almost 2 years. We had lots of online meetings. I'll talk about that in a minute. But having this in-person meeting allowed us to work through some of the sticky issues, create the foundations for that common purpose document that we developed, also to rework our governance and do a lot of the foundational work. And then we've tried to keep that momentum going, particularly by making sure that everyone is aware of who's going to big conferences and then trying to organize meetups at those conferences. So we did this at the Ocean Sciences meeting in New Orleans earlier in the year. We did this in Barcelona. We did it at the World Congress Conference on Marine Biodiversity. And those in-person meetings are essential to trust building. As I mentioned, because we couldn't, even after we got the go-ahead from Taiwan, it was a long time before we could actually bring people together. We decided to start pursuing monthly community meetings. And these are informal get-togethers where we bring people together. We have one-on-one breakouts where people are assigned to breakout groups with hopefully people that they haven't met before, so they can have a little FaceTime. Sometimes they end up with people they already know and they can catch up. Sometimes they end up with people that make them feel slightly uncomfortable, and that also works really well. At these meetings, we don't have tour de tables. We don't have people telling us about their greatest and latest paper, but we do have a circle where people ask for help from the community, and community members will type into the chat the help that they can provide. And it's just a really great way of getting people in touch with each other. We've traditionally had a meeting that was late Europe time and early Europe time. So every other month, one would be early, and then the next month it would be late. That would give people from different time zones more opportunities to join these meetings. And now we're trying to move, so we have a third time zone that is more based in the Pacific, because we have more and more people coming from the Pacific that simply can't make any time zone that works well for North America and Europe. I mentioned the learning circles. Those are also remote. Those meet about once a month, sometimes once every 2 months, depending on who's running them. And so those are all run by the community. And then we found that we have some members of our community who are in places that are just hard to reach remotely. And Christine can attest to this. We have really terrific partners in the Cook Islands, but the internet's poor. We're often meeting with them on their phone, so it's not easy. There's stuff going on because it's usually late in the evening, and so there's things happening in the house. So we made a conscientious effort to spend time with our partners in the field in very remote places. I spent 5 weeks in the South Pacific last year and in the Cook Islands and Tahiti, and I will try to go to Colombia because we have a very good partner from the Wayuu indigenous community in Colombia. But if you want to have people who are really working in the field in remote places, you just have to find new ways of reaching out to them. And that has been a particularly fulfilling part of this work for me. Now, I mentioned before the principles. When we do whatever it is, whether we have a hub meeting or an in-person meeting or a remote monthly meeting, or even these work in the field meetings, we try to embody these principles that you see here. I won't read them, but if there's one thing that really is the glue across all of the OceanCan Knowledge Action Network, it is following these principles and values. And these are the kinds of things that you would just expect of any person that you were friends with, that you wanted to talk with, you wanted to have an open relationship. But it's really important to say these things because, especially if you're just tuning in once a month, sometimes you feel rushed. It's easy for people to forget that there are 20 other people on the call. So we ask people to be concise, considerate, recognize that even if we're holding the meeting in English, not everybody can express themselves well in English, and sometimes you really have to listen to understand. And it is this set of values that has made things work so well, I think, over the past 3 years. A core part of this has been cross-cultural relationship building. So here we have Ngozi Ogukwa, who is on our executive committee. She's from Nigeria. Claudia Baron Aguilar, who is a Wayuu woman from Colombia. And then there's Stella, and Stella is pan-European, you might say. And we, they're together, meeting there, presenting about the OceanCan, sharing. We've all really gotten to know each other well. And it means that we're able to understand the needs of each other, but it's also we're able to navigate misunderstandings because we all know where we're coming from and we've built this trust. We've done that, as I mentioned, by being in person in many cases and doing low stakes activity. So a lot of times people will say, oh, well, I want to involve people in my research project, but I've already thought of what I want to do and I've got a time table and I've got to get work done and it's kind of stressful. That's not the best way to build trust and friendship. The best way is to do fun things that are also personally revealing. We cooked when we were together. We share food and drinks. We also participated in all sorts of different kinds of activities. And so here on the upper left, you'll see this activity that Dwight Owens from Ocean Networks Canada taught us. It's called 3D modeling. It can be done with anything. And it really is try to work together to convey a concept or an idea using these materials. So what we were trying to do is position the ocean can in the context of all of these other ocean networks and the ocean decade, using strings and putty and wires. And it's just really fun, but it requires that you listen to people and understand what they're trying to do with that yarn or that putty. And so this way of working well before the proposal stage, well before the project stage, is essential to building the kind of understanding that is absolutely necessary for co-designing science. As I mentioned, we have more and more people who are doing science, but in Indigenous communities, and they are Indigenous people. So these are people who are from these Indigenous communities. They are often part Indigenous and part Western or from settler communities. And they have pursued degrees in higher education. Could be natural science, social science, anthropology, and the like. And they are at the forefront of bringing science back to their communities. They're people who are working with traditional knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledge systems, which are different from traditional knowledge systems in that they're always adapting. And they're bringing scientific methods directly to their communities. So they're producing science that can be acted on by their traditional leaders, that can be incorporated into youth programs and the like. And we now have Indigenous scientists from Cook Islands, New Zealand, Moorea, Tahiti, Wallis and Futuna, and Colombia. We've done a lot of work with this smaller group within our ocean can to try to understand their needs and to try to put them in touch with each other. A lot of these Indigenous scientists don't realize that there are other Indigenous scientists who are trying to do the same thing that they're doing. So once again, we have this peer-to-peer learning, which is really effective, especially for the younger Indigenous scientists. In addition to scientists, we have traditional leaders and traditional knowledge holders. This is a picture. What the guy you're looking at there is a traditional knowledge holder from the Etolan community, which is of the Amis people in Taiwan. A lot of people don't realize that Taiwan has 16 different Indigenous language groups. And one of those Indigenous peoples was the ancestor community for all of the Indigenous people from Madagascar to Rapa Nui or Easter Island. It's called the Austronesian Migration. So we were able to bring our Indigenous scientists back to Taiwan. And not only the Indigenous scientists, but the woman you see with her back to you is a traditional leader or an Ariki from the Cook Islands. So she's a 27-year-old Maori woman, a science teacher. So she's got basic science and she's the chief. And we were able to bring her there together. And this is kind of a really good example of what we've been trying to do, even at the Indigenous level, bringing traditional knowledge holders together with leaders from a completely different part of the world to exchange knowledge. We try to create a lot of opportunities for our young Indigenous scientists in particular. This is Anthony Vavia. And so just as an example of some of the opportunities that we've been able to create as a network. And then Claudia, who you saw earlier in the picture with Ngozi and Stella, wrote the Indigenous Knowledge section of the UN Decade Working Group 2 visioning paper. So the UN Decade has just written 10 visioning papers, one for each of the decade challenges. Working Group 2 is focused on protecting and restoring marine biodiversity. And Ant and Claudia helped to write that whole section on Indigenous ecological knowledge. We also have brought in our young Indigenous scientists to a webinar series that we're doing with Future Earth on decolonizing science. And we had them last month come together and really tell us about what should Western scientists know before going into Indigenous communities, how to avoid big mistakes, how to, if you're really interested in working with an Indigenous community, how to get started. In June, we'll have another group of Indigenous scientists from our community in the second webinar series, where they're going to talk about the challenges that they've faced in Western academic settings. So these are people who are coming from Indigenous communities, but they're pursuing their PhDs in places like Edinburgh, in Auckland University of Technology, which is where Anthony did his studies. Claudia is doing her PhD at the University of South Florida. And it's not always easy. There are issues of isolation, misunderstanding. And then once they've gotten the PhD, it's very difficult for them to apply the science that they want back in their community. There's a lot of pressure to stay in that academic track in the Western world. And if you do that, what we value in Western universities isn't necessarily what they value as Indigenous scientists. So we've spent a lot of time over the last year, particularly on this facet of the Ocean Knowledge Action Network, and then making sure that they're well connected with people in the network who are not Indigenous, because there's a lot to learn from each other. One of the things that has really become clear, and I keep mentioning this over and over again, but it's peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. And when it comes to really making sure that science and technology are transferred to Indigenous communities and Indigenous users, having it come from an Indigenous scientist is so much more impactful than having it come from a non-Indigenous scientist. And that's why we brought these groups together. This is another picture from Taiwan. People on the left are the Etalon Amis people from Taiwan. And on the right, we have Yamaru Ariki, and then we have scientists from Rarotonga, Mitiaru, Tahiti in the back there, and Claudio is there as well. As we've worked with these Indigenous scientists, one of the things that they have made abundantly clear to us is that the way we meet when we have meetings, scientific meetings in the West, is not the way they like to meet at all. They don't like panels. They don't like 8-minute talks or even 10-minute talks. And so whenever we meet with Indigenous communities or Indigenous scientists, we always ask them, what do you want to do? How do you want to meet? In this case, in Taiwan, we met in a circle. The circle involved community elders. This is later in the day. In the early part of the day, it involved the entire community. We had singing and dancing that kicked off the day. And this required that Stella, who you see there in the red dress, and me right across, took a back seat. We didn't talk at all during this knowledge sharing day. We listened. We really listened. And that's something that's quite different for a lot of scientists. And Christine and I are trying to develop a similar project in the Cook Islands that I'll describe in a minute. But we're at the point now where we're working with our Cook Islander partners to try to figure out, how do we listen? How do we bring these traditional leaders that we're going to be working with together so we can hear what they need? And we're not just trying to sell our science to them. Now, that's the kind of horizontal peer-to-peer knowledge exchange we've talked about. The Ocean Knowledge Action Network has its roots really in these big global networks. And so the Future Earth Network is the one I mentioned. We are part of the Future Earth Network. If you haven't heard of Future Earth, it was created by a number of different national level science organizations at the Rio Plus 20 conference. It's where sustainability science, the term was first coined, and they've created all of these global research networks. So you might be familiar with MBER, which is ocean oriented, or SOLAS, it's another one. PAGES is past geological changes. Did I say that right, Stella?
No, global changes.
Past global changes, I always get the G wrong there. And so we work very closely with them. Future Earth is then also sort of the same kind of global level as other big groups like the World Climate Research Program, SCORE, Ocean Climate Platform. We have a lot of transdisciplinary and social networks we work with. Won't read them to you. We are embedded in the Ocean Decade, and rather than becoming a program of the decade, we really decided to support other decade programs. And we work a lot with Marine Life 2030, where we help bring that network together, participate in the community of practice there, but private sector, et cetera. By focusing on the people and not the deliverables and outcomes, it has produced lots of outcomes, including research proposals among our community members, people inviting people from one part of the community to come visit their university or their program. Decade endorsed actions have developed from the community. We began a little learning circle essentially about what is a gender equality charter and why do you need them? And that led two of our community members to create their own gender equality charters and the like. We also decided not to host any of our own meetings, but really to support other meetings. And so we've been very active at international meetings and regional meetings, and we've written proposals together. So it was a Future Earth proposal that we wrote together that brought us to Taiwan for that meeting between the indigenous scientists and the Etowah community. And then Christine and I wrote another proposal with to the European Space Agency and Future Earth to work with traditional leaders in the Cook Islands to bring them, listen to what they need, and see if we could use Earth observation and space data from the European Space Agency to help them in traditional decision making. We've also been able to help place a lot of our community members in big conferences like the Decade Conference, and we've hosted publications at the ICES Journal, where I'm editor. And so even though our funders initially really wanted us to tell them what we were going to deliver, we said we'd focus on the people and see what they delivered, and they really came through and delivered in the end. Here we are at the end of year 3. We've really developed our way of working, and now we're trying to grow. And so I'm happy to be able to talk to you because we are trying to bring people in from all over the world, and that includes Scotland, the UK, everywhere, into our work. And we will continue this focus on Indigenous science and ocean management, supporting traditional leaders at all levels, and it could be people working at the county level, doesn't matter where you are. We really want to focus on people who are the ones who make decisions. In the lead up for the UN Oceans Conference in 2025, we'd like to host listening sessions where we can give our community members a voice and then take a combined message to this UNOC meeting that'll be held in Nice. And we will continue to focus on these 3 Ocean Decade programs that we are heavily involved with. So I'll just end there. Thanks, Stella, and also Aaron Gallup, who helped put this slide presentation together. And I would be happy to answer any questions you have. I'll just make sure you have my email address here. Last slide there. And of course, you can always find us on oceancan.org, or you can Google me.
Thank you, Linwood. Thank you so much for your time. As I said, if you have a question, please feel free to either turn your camera and microphone on and ask, or we can use the Q&A function. I may start. Is that okay? Can I jump in with a question?
And since we're so few, if everybody turned their camera on, it would be great.
So yeah, I was just wondering if personally, you mentioned the outcomes and things, but is there like a major success or something that you felt personally proud of that the network kind of achieved?
I think really having people come together and take leadership is the biggest success, because we didn't know how well that would work. When we had our first meeting with the 15 people, instead of creating an agenda and telling everyone this is the agenda we're going to follow, we said everyone has to participate in a session and you have to design your own session together. And that worked out great. And the sessions were all really interactive and everyone was took ownership in those. So that is one thing I think that really felt validating for me. I think the other thing is that you can see how interested they have been in really working together to try to connect to this international level. A lot of them felt like they have been left out of these global processes, and they've come together to propose side events and really take charge. And as a collective, they're able to do that in a way that none of them, I think, would have as individuals, or many of them would not have as individuals. So I've also been particularly pleased with that.
That's really lovely to hear. Empowering people essentially to, yeah, be heard. Are there any questions from anybody?
I could jump in.
Yeah, please.
I was going to say,
I'm really proud of the proposal that we got funded with Christine. So
got to deliver it now. And on that topic, I wondered if, from the work you've done so far, any interesting examples or kind of nuggets of information about what's worked in terms of bringing Indigenous knowledge with our very conventional scientific approaches, because I think that's such a challenging topic.
yeah, I think that the one thing that really has become crystal clear is that the way we organize ourselves in Western science into these disciplines, even when we think we're being transdisciplinary, or even when we think we're doing sustainability science, sometimes does not align at all with the way Indigenous people think about the world and the way the world works. And it can be really difficult to understand how our Indigenous partners think and what they're thinking. And you really have to break that, barrier, to crack that nut before you know how to help them with science or how to provide the technologies they need. I've seen many cases with our Indigenous partners where they have been given access to incredible technology. They've taken it because it came with money, and then they don't use it. It's like, what's that big camera over there? Oh, that's for creating 3D models of coral reefs. Well, do you use it? No, it's just too complicated. We'd much rather go out with PVC and do a quadrat and put it down. And you see this over and over again. That's because people didn't listen. They came with an idea and they tried to sell the idea. So really taking a step back, and this is where Christine and I we've spent months really talking with our partners, trying to understand how to get them to express their needs. And even though our partners one of them is a marine scientist, they're very involved in conservation. A lot of times, the first thing they want to talk about is at-risk youth or sports or religion, because that's how they get the young people involved. And then once they've got them, they get them working on science projects and the like. But the people we work with don't think of these as separate things. And so you can't talk about science without talking about sports, because the people who are doing the science are the people doing the sports. And the sports is the carrot that gets them doing science. and then they become scientists and they didn't even know it. So that, I think, has been a really important breakthrough for me, insight for me.
Thank you for the question. Anyone else have any questions? I have another one, if that's okay.
So, do you want to share anything?
I want to hear Bethan's second question.
Okay.
Oh, well, I was just wondering, as you grow, do you foresee there being a major challenge with kind of keeping the trust really that you've built across this network as it kind of grows?
It's the biggest challenge, I think. When we started off, there was a lot of pressure to open up and sort of invite the whole world to come participate. And we decided not to do that. And a lot of people, after 2 years, didn't even know what the Ocean Knowledge Action Network was. They hadn't heard of us. And that's because we didn't want them to have heard of us. We wanted to take this small group of people that someone knew someone in the group. Everybody knew each other in at least one way. Some of the people we work with had actually applied to host the International Project Office and were not successful. And then when we got it, I immediately reached out to them because I knew that they were motivated, and they became good partners. So we grew organically. People would say, oh, I met this person at SMR, for instance, or I met this person at a conference, or I've known this person, I think they'd be really good in our network. And we would bring them in that way. We'd grow organically. But we also tried to be very intentional about not having too many Europeans, for instance, because we didn't want it to be unbalanced, and that would make people from the global south reluctant to participate. So we've tried to grow really slowly. And now what we're doing is encouraging a lot of growth at the hub level with a couple of participants from the hub or the region that then can be active in the bigger network. But if we wanted to have 1,000 people, it would be great to have 200 people in the core who are connecting out to these networks like MASTS or SMMR or the others that could keep them informed. And then they become matchmakers. So you could say, oh, I know someone at Cardiff who's doing work that you should talk to, and they can put people together and keep connecting. So it really is that kind of a network where we want different ways of bringing people together individually. But it's difficult to do if you bring them all together at once. And then, of course, there are people, like when we talked about today, Matt was saying he hoped he could just stay in the background. Well, when you have 100 people on a call, everybody feels that way, and nobody wants to raise their hand. So trying to figure out how to grow in a meaningful way is important, but also just keeping the right tone, making it informal, making people feel comfortable is essential.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Stella, did you want to say something?
No, can you hear me all right? Okay, because I'm sitting in the same room as Linwood, so I cannot really enable my microphone.
Oh, okay.
I don't know why, I must have made a face that said that I want to say something, but I didn't really.
But what are you most proud of that we've done over, or the network has done?
I was going to follow up on something that you just said now, but I got the question last week at the SMMR annual meeting, how you keep the trust going. So that kind of follows up on the question you just asked. And especially since I talked a little bit about the need for long-term projects, really when you work with communities. And so often the way that science is funded is you have a 3-4 year project maybe, and then you pack up and you leave, and then what happens with whatever you created with the community, even if it's a really great project that was co-designed and everyone was part of it, what happens after that? And yeah, so I think that's a really tricky question as well. How do you keep the trust going after a specific project is done? I don't really have a clear answer to that. I just wanted to put that question out there as well.
Well, I'll tell you, it's really time consuming. And our funders for the first 3 years were French science funders. They don't see that as science, right? What do you do all day? It's like WhatsApping people, calling people, just being open to talk to people, writing letters for them, finding opportunities for them. It's really important to do that, to have that kind of network where people are willing to do that for each other. It takes a lot of time, and this is something that's hard to get funded, and sometimes it's hard for scientists to build that into the way they work.
Yeah, it can be quite difficult when there's short-term funding back to back, well, to kind of plan long-term. Any other questions from anybody? Don't be shy.
Jennifer and Amy, would you like to introduce yourselves? Because the others said hi and let us know who they were, but we don't know who you are.
Sure. Sorry, I was a little bit late to join. Sorry, Amy, both jumping in. We actually met quite a while ago, Linwood, when you came to PML. I don't know if you remember, you came and visited Nikki Beaumont, but yeah, I'm Jenny Lockett. I'm head of Impact Group at Plymouth Marine Laboratory down in the southwest of England. Yeah, and Ellen's part of my group as well. We work together, so obviously interested in co-design and kind of building networks. And we have our own kind of, well, we're having an event, for example, in a couple of months' time with lots of stakeholders from across the local area to look at research needs for Tamar and Plymouth Sound MPA. So, you know, very interested in how we co-design stuff with those local people and look at the MPA research needs, start from that angle rather than starting from the science we want to do, which is quite a different way of approaching things for a research organisation like ours.
And I was telling,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
No, don't. I'll be brief. Yeah, hello, my name is Amy Cartwright. Linwood, you came to University of Plymouth and gave a talk a few years ago as well. It might have been on the same trip to Plymouth when you spoke at PML, but I went to your talk then, so I was just interested to hear more about the network that you've created. Yeah, I'm a project manager at the University of Plymouth in the Applied Marine Ecosystems Research Unit. That's about it from me. Thank you.
So Beth Ann, did you know you'd have so many people from PML on this call?
No, and usually I don't actually get to see many faces either, so this is great.
I was telling Beth Ann that she needs to take the ferry to Brittany, and the shortest ferry to Brittany is through Plymouth.
A day trip to Plymouth as well.
Anyhow, well, it's really great to see all of you. I had a call recently with Nikki and Matt Frost and some others to see if we can get Plymouth Marine Lab institutionally interested in the Ocean Knowledge Action Network. But certainly we're interested in having people from PML, SAMS, MAST, and the UK generally, even NOC. We'll let people from NOC participate. So please reach out if you want to get involved, and it can be in different ways. We don't have any membership requirements. We know that people have different amounts of time and different interests, but you know how to get in touch with me. I think all of you do. And I'll be happy to see you in Plymouth sometime soon, or all the way up in Edinburgh. I'm not going to Southampton. It's totally out of the way. Okay.
I've just popped the link to the website and then your email addresses on there, so if anybody is interested, and also Stella as well. So yeah, that can be a way to contact you. And just to say thank you so much for your time again. It's been really interesting to hear about the network, so thank you. And thank you everyone for participating as well. It's been great.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
See you tomorrow, Christine.
Thank you. Bye.